Okay, this is part 2 of sketching quadratic equations, and in this video we're going to look at actual quadratic equation for examples and work out how to sketch this function. So this is a function of x, so this is the input, it's taking numbers in the form of x, and it's giving us numbers out. The output is y, so this is the number that's coming out. And we can very simply represent this using a graph, and we have x on the horizontal axis and y on the vertical axis. And a very powerful technique to work out what's going on with this function is to sketch it. So we're going to use a number of techniques. First off, we want to work out the shape of the graph, and we're going to do this by decomposing the coefficients. So I'm going to write a is equal to 1, this is the x squared coefficient, b is equal to minus 5, the x coefficient, and c is equal to 4. Now, because a is positive, this means that the shape of the graph is going to go up like this. The ends are going to point to positive infinity. So these are the techniques that we looked in the last video. And then secondly, another powerful technique to work out the shape of the graph, we're going to look at the discriminant. And this is b squared minus 4ac. This tells us how many solutions we're going to get. So if we sub in these numbers in here, we'll have minus 5 squared minus 4 times a is 1 and times c is 4. So simplifying this, we have 25 minus 4 times 1 times 4 is 16, and this is 9, which is positive. So this right here tells us we have two real solutions, and this corresponds to the x-axis. So the graph is crossing the x-axis at two separate points. So this is when y equals 0. This is what the discriminant tells us. So we're going to get something looking like this. I've drawn it like this because I know where the solutions are going to be, but now our task is to work out what these solutions are. So we want to work out the values of x such that y is equal to 0, and the value of y such that x is equal to 0. Okay, so the way we do this is by solving this quadratic equation. So first off, we need to set this equal to 0. We have x squared minus 5x plus 4, and we set this equal to 0. So now the values of x that satisfy this equation are going to be the values of x that cross the x-axis right here. They're the values that make y equal to 0. So to solve this is actually quite easy. We can just factorize. We can write this as x minus 4 and x minus 1 equals to 0. And if it was a bit of a scary looking equation and we couldn't factorize this, or we didn't know if we could, then we could just complete the square or use the formula. So you can be quite creative with how you solve this. But now this is in a nice form, and we can work out the solution straight away. We just set each bracket equal to 0, and this is going to give us the solutions of x equals to 4 and x equal to 1. So these are the two values of x such that y is equal to 0. So these are the two x-intercepts. So we have x equal to 1 and x equal to 4. And we're just going to label it on this graph. And then the final thing we want to know is what value of y makes the graph have x coordinate equal to 0. And the way we do this is we look in this equation up here and we set x equal to 0. So if you imagine us moving along this horizontal axis, this is changing the value of x. And if we are at the middle, at the y-axis, this is where x is equal to 0. So if we set x equal to 0 here, this goes away. 0 squared is 0, minus 5 times 0, that's 0 as well. So we're just left with this coefficient here, the constant, the c term. So this value of c tells us how high up the graph is the y-intercept. So this is 4 in this case. And now we've got all the information describing what the graph looks like, where it crosses the x-axis, where it crosses the y-axis, and what the shape of the parabola is. So that is how to sketch a quadratic equation. Okay, so I want to do one more example, and this one is going to be with a negative x squared coefficient. So we're going to do y is equal to minus x squared plus 6x plus 7. And to sketch this, we're going to use exactly the same techniques, all the ones we've looked at previously. So first off, we're going to decompose this into the coefficients. We'll write a is equal to minus 1, that's the x squared coefficient. B is equal to 6, that's the x coefficient, and then c is equal to 7. That's just a constant, the plus c. So now, because a is negative, we know that the shape of the graph is going to point downwards. It's going to be like upside down. So that tells us the shape of the graph just by the sign of a. The next step is to look at the discriminant. This is going to tell us how many solutions this equation has when it crosses the x-axis. So how many times it crosses the x-axis. The discriminant is just b squared minus 4ac. And we're going to plug in these values, see what value this is. So 6 squared minus 4 times minus 1 times 7. It's important to keep track of the sign. This is going to tell us some really useful information about the graph. So we get 36. The negative pops out and it cancels with this negative, so we have plus, and then we just left with 4 times 7. 4 times 1 times 7. 4 times 7 is 28. So this is a positive number plus a positive number. I'm not going to bother working it out, but it's positive. So we know the discriminant is positive. So that tells us we have 2 real solutions. So we have 2 real solutions and the shape of the graph is going downwards. So already we know what it's roughly going to look like. Have the x-axis and the y-axis. So a is negative, so it's going to point down like this, and because there's 2 solutions, it's going to cross the x-axis twice. And now our job is left to find out where does the graph cross the x-axis and the y-axis. So to work out where it crosses the x-axis, we're going to set y equals to 0 and then solve this equation. So let me just rub up some of this to make some space. Okay, so we're going to set y equals to 0, and we're just going to have minus x squared plus 6x plus 7, and this is going to be equal to 0. So just as before, if we're setting y equals to 0, we're looking, so we're looking up here. The value of y that makes this curve equal to 0 is the horizontal x-axis. So the solutions of this equation are going to be exactly where this graph crosses the x-axis. And this is just a quadratic equation, so we can solve this using all the methods you know. First off, we're going to multiply through by minus 1. This is going to make it a bit easier to deal with. We have x squared minus 6x minus 7 is equal to 0. And then this equation we can actually factorize. So this has a nice form. We can write this as product of 2 linear factors, and they need to multiply to get minus 7. So that's minus 1 and 7, or 1 and 7. And we're actually going to see that the combination we need is minus 7 and plus 1. So they multiply together to get minus 7, and then minus 7x plus x, that gives us the minus 6. So that's the factorized form of this quadratic. And again, you could complete the square or use the formula, whatever you prefer. But now we can see that the solutions here are just the values that make this bracket equal to 0. So we get x is equal to 7 and x is equal to minus 1. So 1 positive, 1 negative. And then you can see on this graph, you have to think about which one goes where. But the one on the left-hand side, this is minus 1 and this is 7. So these are the x-intercepts. And the last step is to work out the y-intercept. Didn't mean to scribble that. So the y-intercept, this is when x is equal to 0. So we're just going to go back up into the equation and set x equal to 0. So this term goes, the x term goes as well, and we're just left with the plus c constant, so just the whole number at the end. So this is 7, which means the y-intercept is 7. And this is everything you need to know about this quadratic equation. And we've seen both cases where a is positive and a is negative, so they're going up to infinity and negative down to infinity. So these are all the skills you need to how to sketch a quadratic equation.